Greetings, my excellent friends. This is Ray, back with another episode of Flight Review, here to talk about Shazam! Fury of the Gods, aka the beginning of the 2023 DCEU Farewell Tour. And because of that, there are plenty of people that think this movie is 100% useless. There is no point in watching it, and I certainly shouldn't have spent my matinee price ticket to go see it in IMAX at my local Imagine Entertainment Theater. But I did, because I'm not silly and I like to watch movies that I think I'm going to enjoy. And based on the fact that I thoroughly enjoyed the first movie and its laughably horrific release date 3 weeks before Avengers Endgame, I thought for sure, based on the trailers and everything else I saw for this movie, that I was going to enjoy this one. It looked like the stakes had been raised, the visual effects looked incredible, and come on, anytime you add Helen Mirren and Lucy Liu to your cast, how can you possibly lose? Well, let's see. What did I think about it? I really liked it. Truthfully, I thought it was a very entertaining film. I mean, it's weird because it's real easy for me to sit here and go, well, it's good, but it's not as good as the first one. But in many ways, Shazam! Fury of the Gods is a very different movie than the first one. And yet, as different as it is, as much as the stakes are raised, as bigger and bolder as the visual effects and set pieces are in it, it's still a movie that, more than a lot of other sequels, even in this genre, relies heavily on your knowledge and understanding of the tone and characters from the first movie. I mean, this movie literally picks up where the first movie left off. And I mean, it's been 2 years and they understand and respect the passage of time, but if you haven't seen the first movie, I honestly don't recommend you see this one, truthfully. Now, you might be thinking, well, Ray, that's a no-brainer. It's a sequel. Of course you're going to have seen the first one in order to understand this one. That's not entirely the case with a lot of comic book movies. I love Captain America: The First Avenger. You don't need it for Winter Soldier. And you don't need either of those for Civil War. In fact, if you've seen the first two Avengers movies, you're perfectly fine with watching Civil War, to be honest with you. And for that matter, do we really need to watch the first two Thor movies to understand what Taika Waititi was doing at all in Ragnarok or Love and Thunder? No, because even seeing both of those movies, I still don't understand what he was doing. I digress. My point is that Shazam! Fury of the Gods is very much a continuation of the first film, and because of that, it's very difficult to separate it from the first film in terms of appraising it. The movie really does not hold your hand. It expects that you've seen the first film and that you understand exactly how this world works, how these kids are operating, and what this family is doing going forward as it faces new, more powerful villains the second time around. The thing is, I don't think this is a bad thing about the movie. I think that it just understands exactly what it is and continues the story from the first time around. And I personally had a very entertaining time watching the whole thing, to be honest with you. So let's get into what I liked specifically about Shazam! Fury of the Gods. Starting with the cast. There's not really a whole lot to say. Everybody's pretty much doing what they did from the first movie on, but they're expounding upon it and they're building on it, and they're playing versions of their characters that have clearly gone through the last 2 years, being what they've been at the end of the first movie. Admittedly, there's not as much of the family dynamic between the kids and the parents in this particular film, but again, part of that can be chalked up to the fact that this one really just ups the ante and pushes everything into a world-ending conflict even further than what they dealt with in the first film. For all the issues people have with Zachary Levi, he's figured out how to play this character, and he's pretty much been consistent with that through 2 movies. Same with Asher Angel for the times that we see him on screen, Jack Dylan Grazer, and all the rest of the Shazamly, to be honest with you. And I will say that while it is nice to get some more extensive time with the Shazamly throughout the entirety of the film, it is nice that at certain important points of the film, it's all about Billy Batson and Shazam himself. What do I really need to say about Helen Mirren and Lucy Liu as your badass villains? I mean, that's what they are, seriously, your badass villains. But what I like about their villainy in this particular case is that there is some nuance and there is some extra gravitas and subtlety to what they're doing and how they are behaving. Could they have used a little bit more backstory? Sure. I'm a huge proponent of the villains getting a big backstory and understanding exactly what their motivations are, like we've seen in other DCEU films, like Man of Steel or Aquaman. We don't quite get that here, but you definitely get enough of presence and enough time with Helen Mirren and Lucy Liu to understand exactly where their villainy comes from, and they do a great job with it, seriously. I don't have any issues with them as villains at all. They do not fall under the villain curse that has at times plagued the DCEU and certainly the MCU over the years. You know, to that end, one of the things that popped into my head was, this is kind of a better Thor the Dark World. And I'm somebody that likes Thor the Dark World, truthfully, and even though this is on a bigger and, believe it or not, more grandiose scale in terms of visual effects, which I'll get to in a bit, the fact that the villains weren't wasted in this film, like unfortunately Christopher Eccleston subjectively was in Thor the Dark World, says a lot about the Shazam Fury of the Gods. Before getting to the visuals, let's talk about the writing for a second. This isn't a necessarily earth-shattering script, and that's why I think the critic reviews and some of the other audience reviews are not quite as strong on this movie as I might be. I wouldn't call it a pedestrian script by any stretch of the imagination, but it does have a lot of exposition at times, and while I was okay, and maybe it took me an extra minute or two to figure out exactly what was said and what was going on, I could see somebody in the general audience being a little put off by exactly what is happening in the film. That doesn't mean it's confusing, because I didn't find it overly confusing, but I'm also not a member of the general audience and have been initiated into the world of magic and comic book wizardry, to be honest with you. It's not a perfect script, but it's solid, and it's got a lot of really good emotional beats in it, just like the first film did, and I guess the biggest thing I would say is that it's less grounded than the original script for the first film was, because of all the otherworldly, stakes-raising stuff that they put into it. And that leads me to the visuals, which, to be very honest with you, are top-notch, seriously. There were times watching this movie where it felt like I was in a Harry Potter film, in a good way, because I love the Harry Potter movies, and I love the visuals from those movies, and the crispness and the sharpness and the contrast of a lot of what they were doing in those movies absolutely shows up here for certain scenes with the Rock of Eternity and some of the numerous creatures that you see throughout. Like, they really took their time with the visual effects in this particular film, and I'm wondering if those extra 3 months or so from pushing the release date from December up to March of this year actually helped that. If so, bravo. That's exactly what you should do, and this is the fruits of their labor, truthfully. Fury of the Gods is a gorgeous film in many ways, with respect to the visual effects, with respect to how Sandberg films certain things. There's even some slow-mo sequences that I didn't know we were going to get that he absolutely puts in here, and they didn't feel gratuitous. They felt like they were absolutely fitting the tone and the tenor of the story that was being told and how the action was being played out on screen, and no, in many ways, it's a feast for the eyes, especially the third act. Which is funny because you know how comic book movie fans love to complain about third acts. I think we're going to have an interesting discussion, at least for a little bit here, about the third act of Shazam Fury of the Gods and how, in my opinion, visually stunning it is. Now on to the music. I was a little concerned that they switched Benjamin Wallfisch from the first film for Christoph Beck in this film, because when you switch composers, you tend not to have continuity between themes with a particular franchise. Marvel has done this a ton, even back to the Fox X-Men days. But even though Christoph Beck's score is quite different than Benjamin Wallfisch's for the first film, and doesn't necessarily have a easily discernible theme for Shazam and his friends throughout this movie, it's still really good, and absolutely fits the gravity of the action that we're seeing on screen. And that's the most important thing when it comes to a musical score for me, is it has to match what we're seeing visually and what we're hearing auditorially, from dialogue scenes to big poignant action scenes with massive sound effects and everything like that. No, this matched. It absolutely matched, and I think Beck did a fantastic job with respect to the score for this film. So if I were to summarize Shazam Fury of the Gods, I would say this. It is quite possibly going to be the best DCEU movie that nobody sees. And I say nobody in the figurative sense because obviously I've seen it and plenty of others have already seen it and more are going to see it, so you can't say that nobody saw it, no matter how many trolling pictures of empty theaters anybody wants to post on Twitter. But what I'm getting at here is the tracking for this movie, not very good obviously, and they're not expecting that it's going to make a whole lot at the box office. So unfortunately this film could absolutely fall by the wayside as far as the general audience is concerned, and in my opinion, it doesn't deserve it. I think it is certainly one of the upper-tier DCEU films. Do I like it better than Black Adam? Yes. Yes, I do. And I liked Black Adam. I didn't review it here, but I did enjoy that movie for what it was. This is better. Is it better than the first Shazam film? Again, like I said earlier, hard for me to immediately say yes or no to that, because there are things that this movie does that the first film doesn't even attempt, but the grounded nature and the more familial, heartfelt tone of the first film isn't quite recreated in this film because of, again, how grandiose the entire set piece is. Fury of the Gods is at least a mid-tier DCEU film, in my opinion. And whether or not it's better than the first one depends on whether or not you like the bigger VFX and the massive set pieces and the world-ending calamities, or if you prefer a more grounded approach. And I know it's weird thinking of the first Shazam as a grounded approach, since this whole thing is about magic and a kid being imbued with the powers of the Greek gods every time he says a phrase. But if you see the movie, you'll get exactly what I'm talking about. So overall, my hat's off to David Sandberg and the cast and crew for a very solid film that absolutely is, like I said, no lower than a mid-tier entry in the DCEU. It does have a mid-credit scene and a post-credit scene, because as David Sandberg said on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, he's been told by James Gunn and DC Studios that nothing that he does in the Shazam corner of the universe affects any of the future DCU plans. So, depending on how this film does, it could garner a third movie. And if it does, that'll be really interesting, because what they set up in the mid-credit scene, and even in the post-credit scene, is something that could be very interesting to see fleshed out on screen. I have already seen somebody on Twitter complain about a particular character that's in the mid-credit scene, and you know what, that's your business, it's all subjective. You want to be that bitter about it, you go right ahead, but I didn't have any problems with it at all. Oh, and one more thing. With respect to the cameo that was spoiled in one of the TV spots about a week or so ago, I will just say this without revealing who or what it is. In my opinion, the general audience would absolutely have no idea what that scene that they saw in the TV spot was referring to until the light bulb clicked in their head at that moment in the movie. It's obviously going to be different for us fans, right? Because our brains are always going, and we are so connected to the source material and so connected to these franchises that we're going to be in overdrive even while we're watching the movie, anticipating exactly when that particular scene is going to come up. But most people in the general audience that see this movie are going to completely forget that that scene even exists, if they even saw the TV spot to begin with. So no, I don't think it's this earth-shattering, horrific piece of marketing by Warner Brothers yet again. I'm not freaking out over that. I get why they did it. I don't entirely agree with it as a fan, but I really don't think it's going to harm anything as far as the general audience is concerned. And it surely will not be the reason that Shazam! Fury of the Gods doesn't do well at the box office, if it in fact doesn't do well at the box office. And for the record, I really liked the scene when it came up, and I thought it made a ton of sense. So those are my honest thoughts on Shazam! Fury of the Gods, our first stop on the 2023 DCEU Farewell Tour. Gets a thumbs up from me, but of course I have a wide strike zone and I go into movies saying, prove to me that you're bad, so I tend to enjoy a hell of a lot more of what I watch. If and when you go see it, you may feel differently, or you may agree with me. In any case, I hope you do enjoy it, and as always, it's all subjective.